Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Pittsburgh Sports Memories podcast. I am Tim Hannon.
And I'm Steve Wirt.
And as always, we're going to delve into some Pittsburgh sports history. And today we're going to cover and rank the top 10 forgotten Pittsburgh sports stories. So Pittsburgh sports history has a lot of famous, well-known stories, Immaculate Reception and things that happen like that. You have all kinds of other stories that happen that maybe aren't as famous but are certainly well-known, like Doc Ellis pitching a no-hitter when he was tripping on acid, or the Stanley Cup ending up on the bottom of Mario's pole. So all kinds of famous stories. But we wanted to take this episode and delve into some stories that maybe aren't as well remembered, and just things that happened that maybe people talked about at the time, but maybe they just don't remember as much years later. And so we're going to rank them 10 to 1. But before we get into the top 10, we're going to start with a few honorable mentions that didn't quite crack the top 10. So the first honorable mention of a forgotten sports story is that time that the Penguins had a real penguin as their mascot. And so what had happened in 1968, the Penguins were still a new team. They were an expansion team, and hockey wasn't well known here in Pittsburgh, and they were trying to gain some traction with the local fans. And so the original owner, a guy named Jack McGregor, one of the things he did was that he would bring a real penguin named Pete the Penguin, onto the ice between periods.
Nice bit of alliteration there. Yeah.
It is. I see what they did there, Pete the Penguin. And they actually had him on like a little leash, like a dog leash, and they'd walk him onto the ice. And it ends up being pretty popular. Like, the fans all love it, and they can't wait to see Pete come out in between periods. Unfortunately, after a while, Pete starts to look really sick, and they take him to the vet, and they find out that he has pneumonia. And McGregor's like shocked. He's like, wait, how can a penguin get pneumonia? Penguins live in the Arctic. Penguins can't get pneumonia. Well, it turns out that Pete was actually a South African penguin, and they're not supposed to be on the ice. They're from South Africa. So they didn't realize that there's different species of penguins.
Yeah, I think the emperor penguin lives in Antarctica.
Yeah.
And there's no penguins at the North Pole either. They're all at the South Pole.
That's a fun fact.
A bunch of fun penguin facts for you.
Okay.
But yeah, and there's penguins that live on all the little islands around the bottom of South America,
And I guess that's what
he's probably from? South Africa too, because that's kind of in the southern hemisphere.
Right.
So he was more of a warm weather penguin.
He was definitely a warm weather penguin, and bringing him on the ice all the time and having
if they would have had an emperor penguin, they probably would have been okay.
Yes. So oops. Pete battles valiantly for his life. It's actually covered in the local papers every day, his condition.
Wow.
But ultimately, the pneumonia ends up killing Pete. So that's pretty sad. And the Penguins, not only do they bring a warm weather penguin onto the ice and essentially sort of are responsible for his death, but they also make the dubious decision to have his body stuffed and put on display in the lobby of the Civic Arena.
That's not weird at all.
Well, it's like, oh, hey, welcome here. Let me take your ticket. Come look at the body of our dead mascot.
Maybe they should put him beside the dodo bird in the Carnegie Museum of Natural History.
It's just a weird decision. There's animal rights people that get very upset, and then somebody steals him. Somebody actually steals Pete out of the lobby, and he's never seen again. So
maybe they gave him a proper burial.
Maybe in someone's attic.
There's Pete the Penguin.
Beachview, there's Pete the Penguin. Yeah.
I didn't steal him.
Not implying that you did, just because.
In 1968, I did not exist.
So that's sort of a story that people don't remember. But I thought that was an interesting one. Not quite good enough to crack the top 10. Another honorable mention is the time that the Steelers head coach went to the wrong game. Now, Steve had already covered this one in our episode about Art Rooney.
This is classic, yes.
But it's a good story. It's worth repeating. So in 1938, the Steelers were scheduled to play the Eagles. their head coach and Pro Football Hall of Famer Johnny Blood McNally, who, by the way, has the best nickname in the history of sports, Blood McNally, he's nowhere to be found for this game. Like, they're ready to take the field. They're like, where's coach? And he's nowhere to be found. Well, McNally had mistakenly thought the Steelers had a bye week. He's in Los Angeles at the Rose Bowl watching a game there. And reporters actually come up to him and they're like, why are you here? Shouldn't you be at the Steeler game? He's like, no, that's next week. And they're like, no, they're playing right now in Philadelphia. So
I thought it was in West Virginia.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. It was. They were playing Philadelphia.
That was where he got confused because they were playing. For some reason, Rooney decided to play and I think it was a regular season game too.
Yeah, it was
against the Eagles in Huntington. Why?
I think because they were trying to expand their fan base,
Oh, okay.
and we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. So that's a good teaser because Rooney wanted to get fans outside of Pittsburgh to watch the Steelers, and we'll talk about that in one of our ranked stories. And the funny thing is, and Steve, you mentioned this too, that Rooney was going to fire him, but he said the players loved him so much, and so quote, Rooney said, "I told him, John, you have to make the game." And I just love
you got to show for work and don't do that anymore.
I just love the visual of Rooney and Blood McNally sitting down for an end of the year performance review. It's like, okay, let's talk about the things you did good. Well, I think you really coached up the young players very well, and they're learning very well. Now let's talk about opportunities for improvements. Number one, I think it's really important that you show up for all the games. Now I know you showed up for 11 out of 12 of them, but just missing one, it's not so good.
And we only have 12 of them.
Yeah, right.
The missing one is kind of a high percentage.
Head coach just not showing up for a game. And I know it was a different time and a different era, but it's still a story that's pretty interesting. Another honorable mention, and I think more people would probably remember this because it's pretty recent, but that time that Pitt football had 6 different head coaches in the same calendar year. It's hard to believe. I mean, college football, any sport, you're not going to turn through coaches all that often, but some professional franchises, New York Yankees did that under Steinbrenner, and the Cleveland Browns have done that. But
That's the infamous end of this one episode where Steinbrenner lists all the coach.
Yeah.
He says Billy Martin 4 different times. He's
Right.
Bill Varden, Billy Martin.
Right. But colleges, you don't typically see that. So this all starts in December of 2010 when Pitt fires head coach Dave Wanstead. We talked about Dave in some of our previous episodes and his era. And this happens after the regular season, but before Pitt is scheduled to play in the prestigious BBVA Compass Bowl. So they need a coach for the BBVA Compass Bowl. So Phil Bennett, who's Wanstead's defensive coordinator, is promoted as the interim head coach for that bowl game. So that's 2 head coaches. Pitt hires a guy named Michael Haywood to be the permanent head coach. But just 2 weeks after he's hired, Haywood is arrested on felony domestic violence charges. That's not really what you want for someone coaching college kids. So 2 weeks after he's hired, he is fired. So that's now 3 head coaches, and we're not even a month past when they fired Wanstead. So they didn't really do their homework on vetting Michael Haywood. The next coach they hired, they didn't do very good vetting either because they hire Todd Graham, and if they would have vetted him, they might have learned that he actually doesn't have a soul. He's hired to replace Haywood, and brings the quote-unquote high-octane offense to Pittsburgh. That doesn't go well. He goes 6-6 in 12 games. And then, as we've talked about in previous episodes, he bolts for Arizona State.
And that was actually the second time in his career he'd done that. He'd gone to Tulsa for 1 year.
Right.
And back to Rice or...
Well, because he didn't have a soul.
And the one school actually wrote a hate fight song about him. It was they literally I forget if it's Tulsa or Rice has a hate fight song or something about him.
And Graham wasn't the first head coach that left his school for a bigger
But after one
opportunity.
Season is kind of unprecedented.
After one season, and he asked the one of the assistant coaches to text the players.
Yeah.
Text the players, dear players.
We could do a
taking
whole
another job.
podcast on Todd Graham.
We really could.
Yeah.
I mean, we did the most reviled episode, and we definitely had him on there. So that's coach number 4 is gone. Well, once again, just like the previous year, Pitt is scheduled to play in, again, the BBVA Compass Bowl because if anybody owned the BBVA Compass Bowl, it was.
I think they
the
beat
Pitt Panthers.
Kentucky one of these years.
They
in one of
beat
the
them.
bowl.
That was the year before. That was 2010.
So SEC couldn't beat Pitt and their interim head coach. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Kentucky was the cream of the crop in the SEC, but nevertheless.
No, they're in the SEC. Any team in the SEC is automatically better than every other team in college football, including some of the teams in the NFL. So that ESPN told me so. So.
Well, in 2011, they're also scheduled to play in the BBVA Compass Bowl. And so, again, they have to hire an interim head coach. It's Keith Patterson. That's
and they did
5.
lose I think they played Southern Miss.
Yes, they lost.
And they
that
lost
game.
to Southern
yes.
Miss, yeah.
Wow, good
So the
memories, Steve.
SEC was back on top that year. They could figure out how to beat a team and their interim coach.
Congratulations
Congratulations to them.
I'm so impressed that you remember the history of the BBVA Compass Bowl. Maybe we should do a whole episode on the history of the BBVA Compass Bowl. Finally, in December of 2011, which is, again, one calendar year after Ronstadt was let go, Paul Chryst is hired as the 6th head coach in a year. And Chryst does stay for a while and does some good things. But, man, 6 head coaches in 1 year.
And you know what the fallout from all this was they lost. The only time they've ever lost to an FBS Division I AA school, they lost to Youngstown State that first game.
With Paul Chryst.
Yeah. And that really wasn't Paul Chryst's fault. So I will let Paul Chryst, I thought, was a pretty good coach.
Yeah, that was a mess. I mean, they've recovered pretty well from that.
Well, yeah, the next week they beat Virginia Tech.
Yeah, I mean, but that whole era was just a disaster.
Paul Chryst brought some stability. He fit in well in Western Pennsylvania, whereas Todd Graham did not fit in at all. I think he's more of a snake oil salesman, and I think that plays better where he was like in Arizona State and like Texas. I think that plays better there for some reason.
Yeah, I don't know if Todd Graham fits in anywhere that's like.
He lasted 4 or 5 years at Arizona State, but like I said, he just comes off as a snake oil, as just somebody that's sleazy.
Right. Our last honorable mention is that time that Heinz Field played Happy Music as Willis McGahee lay dead on the turf. So most people, I mean, everybody remembers the 2008 AFC Championship game, one of the great games in Steeler history against the Ravens, one of the most hard-fought games in Steeler history. And everybody remembers that Troy Polamalu has the famous pick six against Joe Flacco, and that sends the Steelers to the Super Bowl. What people don't remember is when Troy scores that touchdown, it put the Steelers up by 2 scores, and it essentially iced the game, but there were still 4 minutes left. So, like, the Ravens aren't going to just take a knee, right? They're going to keep trying to score and try to maybe do an onside kick or whatever. So the Ravens get the ball back, and Willis McGahee's the running back for the Ravens. He catches a pass in the flat. He's absolutely destroyed on it. Just a super violent hit by Ryan Clark. He fumbles because his body just goes limp. The ball comes out. The Steelers recover, and that's sort of the official end of the game. But McGahee, he doesn't move. Like, he gets hit. He's laying there. He's not moving.
I think
at all.
they carted him off.
They did. They brought stretchers out. Well, as they're bringing the stretchers out, so remember, just a few minutes earlier, the whole stadium is on fire. I was at that game. I mentioned this before. I'm like hugging strangers. Everybody's just going crazy. And now this guy's laying there, and it's very somber. Everybody's quiet. Everybody's concerned. It's like he plays for the Ravens, but the guy's obviously very hurt and very quiet. And then all of a sudden, over the Heinz Field loudspeakers, they start playing Down on the Corner, the Creedence Clearwater Revival song, Down on the Corner. And if you ever heard that song, it's very like snappy and happy.
Upbeat, yeah.
And so it was just very bizarre. Like, they're bringing the stretcher out. They're like checking his vitals. You don't know if he's paralyzed. You don't know if he's alive. And it's like, dun, 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 early in the evening, just about supper time.
Down on the corner.
Yeah, I mean, it was really out of place. And I didn't understand why they would be playing happy music.
Well, the policy used to be, and I've learned a lot more Pitt games than Steeler games, is like when a player gets hurt, normally they don't put anything on the board. Like, they'll put like a little like spinning logo or whatever on the scoreboard, and they won't play anything.
Yeah.
And the band doesn't play or anything.
Yeah,
and I think that's pretty much what they do with the Steeler games when somebody's like seriously hurt. Like, they just
right.
And that's what they but I think I remember reading there was some confusion, like the guy didn't think he was hurt or wasn't sure what to do. But I just remember also is Jim Rome absolutely making fun of this. Like the same way you're like, oh, Willis McGahee, yay, like, spinal fracture. And he's like, down on the cork. Yeah. It's like, cue the CCR. It was bad.
Like who was sitting up there and thought, like, man, everybody seems so sad. What can let's pick this up a little bit. Come on, it's a party, guys. We're going to the Super Bowl. Yeah. I mean, and so it like you said, Jim Rome. There was a few. I know somebody on the Ravens made us think about it, and rightfully so. But I think it kind of got lost to history because the big story was the Steelers were going to the Super Bowl. Troy made the interception, and fortunately McGahee was okay.
Yeah.
And so that one just kind of got lost. But I remember standing there, and I just was like, what in the world are they doing? Why are we listening to this song right now? And so now I think every time I hear that song, it always just makes me think of poor Willis McGahee. So those are some honorable mentions. Now we're going to get into our top 10 forgotten sports stories. And number 10, we're going to go back to the Baltimore Ravens. And number 10 is that time that Terrell Suggs put a bounty on the Steelers and the NFL did nothing. So you may recall the Bountygate scandal, where the NFL once basically made the New Orleans Saints forfeit an entire season via suspensions and taking away of draft picks and suspending their head coach Sean Payton for an entire year. And this was all because they had allegedly put a bounty on quarterback Brett Favre. And this was in the 2009 NFC Championship game. And what that meant was they had a pot of money, and whoever hurt Brett Favre would get the pot of money, right? That was the bounty.
Buddy Ryan used to do that.
Yeah. And it was do you remember the reaction to that, Steve? It was like, oh, that's in the...
Yeah, there was a lot of, like, to use an internet expression, clutching of pearls and,
Yes.
like, won't somebody think of the children
Right.
kind of, like,
Right.
you know, if you watch The Simpsons, you know, like, oh, my word, my stars.
Right.
In my years, well, I've never, you know... Like, and not just from, like, you know, the usual suspects in the media, like other, like, players in the league. Well, I never.
Right.
Like, really?
Well,
You've not played football since you're 11, and, like, I've seen youth coaches say that. Yeah, so yeah.
so yes. So there's a monstrous reaction to it. And whether you agree or disagree, what the issue here was, so that's in 2009. Literally just one season earlier, in 2008, okay, this wasn't like 1974 that we're talking about. This is one season earlier. The Ravens are playing the Steelers, and during that game, Ray Lewis breaks the shoulder of Steelers' first-round pick Rashard Mendenhall, which ends his season. So Mendenhall was a rookie that year. He only played in 3 or 4 games because Ray Lewis put him out for the season. During a radio show the next week, the interviewer asked Terrell Suggs if they put a bounty out on Mendenhall. And I'm going to read Suggs. This is his exact quote when asked that question. Suggs, definitely. The bounty was out on him, and the bounty was out on Hines Ward. We just didn't get to Hines Ward between the whistles. Suggs also called Ward a dirty player and a cheap shot artist, and threatened him for the next game. He said, quote, we have something in store for him. So basically, like, the bounty was still out, apparently, on Ward. Brian Billick had been the coach of the Ravens for years. This was his first season. He had been let go after the 2007 season, and Harbaugh was the coach at this point. But Brian Billick, again, was like 4 games removed from being the Ravens coach. And he even came out and confirmed it. And he said, quote, every team does it. This was on the Dan Patrick show. Billick said, every team does it. Now, to go out and talk about it publicly is about as foolish as a thing as I've ever heard. So Billick basically says, yeah, that's for sure true, but really dumb of Suggs to come out and admit it publicly. So where the Saints, you had this accusation of bounty stuff, the Ravens were very open about they did it. And the NFL, it causes a little bit of a stir, and the NFL says, like, oh, we're looking into it. But then it just, like, kind of dies, and nothing happens.
Well, too, you got to remember Greg Williams lied about it, and I think Peyton lied about it. Like, they said they weren't doing it, and then the NFL was like, somehow had proof that they were. So I don't know if that played into it, like with the Saints investigation. But I do remember the Saints did it the week before to Alex Smith, and no one cared. Like, they were, I don't know if that was
Kurt Warner.
Or there was one, they were like jumping on people's heads. Like,
Yeah.
they were hitting people in the head, and there was no flags, no nothing. And hitting like quarterback in the head was definitely illegal by that point in
like
the NFL. And nobody, like you said, it wasn't Tom Brady, it wasn't Brett Favre,
right.
It wasn't one of the people that you can't do that to.
That's exactly what it was. It wasn't Brett Favre, and where was the clutching of pearls? Where was all that stuff? Whenever Suggs came out and said they did it, and literally 1 year later, like, again, this was not like a bygone era where somebody, you're in Jack Tatum or one of those guys. This had happened a year earlier, and no one cared because it wasn't Brett Favre. So I just think that's one of those stories that always gets forgotten. All the Bountygate stuff, everybody remembers Bountygate, and that was horrible, and we could never allow that to happen again. But literally a year earlier, the NFL was like, well, who's Richard Mendenhall? Well, who cares about that guy?
Yeah.
And but it's Brett Favre.
Well, especially who did it too. Ray Lewis has always been like one of the favored sons in the NFL. So
yeah, that too.
yeah.
But I mean, I just Brett Favre. The media worshipped Brett Favre. Everything Brett Favre did, they changed the rules for Brett Favre because that was a game where he lost in overtime and he didn't get the ball, and so they changed the overtime rules.
Yeah.
I mean, they loved Brett Favre.
They did this Hines Ward even like when Hines Ward like blocking too aggressively. I would call that. It's like really you can do that.
Right.
It's just
so I just think
I guess tackling too aggressively isn't a thing either. It's like,
I just think that's a story that's worth remembering because it just shows the hypocrisy of not only the NFL but the NFL media, where one team does it and it's horrible, the other team does it and it's like back page news.
Well, it's and it's odd how like the NFL well, not odd, but I guess those are the people that make their money and they're the face of their league, so they're going to cover for them more than like Richard Mendenhall was. I guess they just figured was never going to be more than a 4 or 5 year player.
Right.
So.
Well, and they were right about that, but and certainly we as Steelers fans are guilty of some hypocrisy too, and watch to get into one of those later. So forgotten story number 9 is another one that we've covered before, but again, I got to mention it again. That time Tom Brady saved Sidney Crosby's career. And I know this will anger some people for me saying this, but this is what happened. I mean, this is just what happened. Crosby, we covered this in our Series from Hell episode. He had a series of concussions that caused him to miss the second half of the 2011 season, almost all of the 2012 season. The Penguins are kind of carrying the slack, but Sidney Crosby, their best player and franchise leader, I mean, he hasn't played in almost 2 years, and you're wondering, is he ever going to play again? And he had these concussions, and that can take a while to recover from. But he was like almost a year removed from having the concussion. He still was having these symptoms. Nobody could figure it out. And I don't know how Sidney Crosby and Tom Brady know each other, but apparently they do. And Tom Brady says, hey, there's a specialist that you should see. He's out in Utah. And apparently Sidney Crosby takes his advice. He goes and sees a specialist. The specialist discovers that it's not the concussion symptoms. It's a neck injury that Crosby has that's causing all these problems. And apparently once they treat that, Crosby returns to the ice, and he's really been fine ever since in terms of those issues. So if Tom Brady doesn't help his friend Sidney Crosby and get him to the specialist, does Sidney Crosby come back? I mean, that's a fair question to ask.
Well, I think they're all, like, including the doctor, member of the Secret Order of the Stonecutters. Yeah. So they got their flash the little ring, sing their song.
I think it's a secret order of the TB12, like the old TB12 rings.
Yeah. Yeah, and they go, ding. I mean, that's a nice thing, maybe. Yeah, just kind of professional courtesy there. So
yeah,
good for TB12.
And I know we're all supposed to hate Tom Brady, but he really helped Crosby in this case, and he really helped the Penguins, and maybe the Penguins don't win 2 more cups if Tom Brady doesn't step in. So, again, one of those stories no one remembers or likes to remember, but that's what happened. Number 8 is that time that the Pirates...
Yes. Going back to the 19th century. Yes, baby.
Yes, we're gonna go probably the furthest back we've ever went on this show.
This might be before electricity was common or indoor plumbing.
So number eight is that time that the Pirates changed their nickname just to spite Philadelphia.
But don't worry, it's only 20 years after the Civil War. 20 or 30 years.
So you occasionally see sports franchises change their nickname. Sometimes it's controversy and political correctness, like with the Redskins or teams like that. Sometimes it's marketing. You saw like the New Orleans Hornets in the NBA change their name to the Pelicans. So sometimes teams will do it just to have some.
It's definitely more Pelicans than Hornets in New Orleans.
I don't know, but
Pelicans are less threatening.
I mean, the Tennessee Oilers changed to the Tennessee Titans. It's just sometimes.
Well, I had no idea Tennessee was such an oil-producing state.
but again, so yeah, sometimes it's based on the geography. And sometimes they don't. Like the Los Angeles Lakers, there's no lakes in Los Angeles, but
they were
in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Anyway, point being that teams do change their names sometimes. Well, way back in 1890, the pro baseball team that was in Pittsburgh, the same team that's still here today, they weren't called the Pirates. They were called the Pittsburgh Alleghenies. The Alleghenies played in the National League at that time, again, where they still sort of play today. I don't know if playing's really, it's a little too strong of a word for the Pirates team we have today. But anyway.
Don't worry, there's still a chance that the Steelers might win more games than the Pirates. Although they have 10 wins now, so it's getting a little problematic for the Steelers there. Yeah,
there's still hope.
Yeah.
So the Pirates the Alleghenies are in the National League. There are rival leagues at this time. One of the rival leagues was called the American Association, and Philadelphia had a team in the American Association called the Athletics. And the Athletics had a pretty good second baseman. His name was Lou Bierbauer. And Bierbauer had left the A's after the 1889 season to play in the newly formed Players League. So back then, the owners really, they controlled everything. The players got nothing. And some of the star players back then decided, hey, you know what, we're going to form our own league and call it the Players League. It's going to be really beneficial. We're going to give the players most of the money. And unfortunately, the league doesn't succeed. It dies after one season. And so the players that defected, now, at least the Athletics are under the assumption that, okay, our second baseman went to go play for that other league. The league folded. Now he belongs to us again. And so he would be back in Philly for the 1891 season. Well, the Alleghenies see it differently, and they go sign him to a big contract. And the Athletics say, no, you can't do that. He's our player. The Alleghenies say, no, he left your team. He's a free agent, and we can go sign him. And they actually have to bring in an arbitrator to rule on this, and the arbitrator rules in favor of Pittsburgh. And so the Philly team and their fans are outraged, and they start mockingly calling the team in Pittsburgh the Pirates because they pirated their best player. And the Alleghenies are kind of like, Pirates, I like that, Pittsburgh Pirates. And they actually officially changed their name to the Pittsburgh Pirates. So like instead of letting that get to them, they just go along with it and actually change their nickname just to spite the fans in Philadelphia for calling them that. And they're still known as the Pirates today.
Do we know if this A's team is at the Philadelphia Athletics, the team?
So it's a great question, and I had the same question. It is not the same team.
Okay.
So that team.
So no Connie Mack or anything like that.
That team played in the American Association. The Philadelphia Athletics with Connie Mack, that was an American League team. The American League did not exist yet. So this team folded, and a few years later, when the American League started, there was a new Philadelphia Athletics, and that team eventually became the Kansas City Athletics.
Which makes it nice and confusing, yeah.
And
that are in Oakland, yeah.
Today are the Oakland Athletics, so yeah, not the same team. Forgotten story number 7 is that time that the Penguins put the regular season games on pay-per-view. So we did an episode, our Goal That Saved the Penguins episode, we talked a lot about just the horrible mismanagement during the time that Howard Baldwin owned the Penguins in the 1990s, and how he was always strapped for cash because he had made these terrible deals. So he was always looking for ways to make some of his money back. And in 1993, the Penguins are sort of at the height of their popularity. They've just won 2 Stanley Cups. And Baldwin decides to put a handful of regular season games on pay-per-view. So if you had cable or whatever, normally you could watch a Penguin game. And here he takes a handful of the games. He says you can only watch these games specifically if you pay for them. And he called it Pens Vision. And I think you didn't just get the games. I think you got some other stuff in the package of Pens Vision. But the big thing was you got like these 6 or 7 regular season games. So back in those days, and this is where I'm going to feel really old, you didn't have digital cable or internet or anything where you could like click a button and put in your credit card number and get the game. Yeah. The way it worked was on your cable, you had like, 30 channels, 40 channels.
I remember this. Yeah.
And then like channel 98, like way away from all the other channels, was like this scrambled signal. And those were the pay-per-view channels, like 98, 99. And if you put those channels on, you could hear the audio, but it would be a real scrambled picture. And you had to buy a box or rent a box. And then you'd hook up the box to the TV, and that would unscramble the signal. That was how you did pay-per-view. And pay-per-view was actually pretty popular. Like for boxing matches, Mike Tyson was big at the time. Mm-hmm. So like a Mike Tyson fight, a lot of people did pay-per-view. WWF WrestleMania, a lot of people did pay-per-view.
I actually remember that box that had to be. No, I don't see. That was more early '80s, but I remember, like, we had a box, and it had a key in it, and to get like certain upper level channels, like the Disney Channel, because like to watch it, I would have to turn a key. Then my parents would just leave the key in it, and you would turn the key, and that would unlock the Disney Channel and HBO and Showtime. It was kind of weird.
So you like paid for the key basically every month?
I guess so, yeah.
And
I
it
guess
comes
that
with
was so
the-
the cable company didn't have to take. But eventually they just got rid of that. And
Yeah.
I remember the wired remotes.
Yes.
Like you had a remote. It wasn't like,
I know.
It was like literally a wire connected to you.
Again, I know this is.
I just remember it got
1993.
all connected in our house, and we just like gave up and set it on the TV, and you'd have to get up old school and like punch in the number.
And this is 1993, but man, just having this conversation makes it feel like it's ancient history. So anyway, that's what you had to do. And again, people did that for Mike Tyson fights. People did not do that for Penguin regular
Especially
season
regular
games.
season, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't even playoff games. It was a huge failure. And that was the last time that Baldwin attempted to put regular season games on pay-per-view. I mean, I don't remember how much it cost, but you'd be better off buying a ticket and going to those games if they were home games. Than you
That was
would
back in the
paying for it.
KBL days, I guess, too, or was it
Right.
before? I don't
No,
know.
the games were on KBL, but they.
Which I don't know.
apparently-
What did KBL? I don't even remember what KBL stand for. I don't know.
I have no idea, but that was the station that broadcast the games, and they still had most of the games. But yeah, just sort of a lot of things Baldwin did to try to make money. That was one of the dumber ones. Number 6 is that time Duquesne basketball took a huge stand against racism. So I think this is a cool story that a lot of people don't know about. On December 23rd, 1946, Duquesne's basketball team was scheduled to play the University of Tennessee here in Pittsburgh. They're actually playing the game in McKeesport at I think it was the Votech High School out there at the time, because, and this is just a sign of the times, Duquesne had donated all their bleachers in their gym for a scrap drive during World War II. So Duquesne didn't have any place to sit in their gym, so they're playing their home games out in McKeesport. And this game, it's again December 23rd. It's right before Christmas Eve. People probably have off work the next day, and it's a huge sellout, 2,600 fans. And to give you an idea of for 1946 basketball, that's a lot of people. And 2,600 fans is actually more than the average attendance of a present-day Duquesne basketball game.
Jeez.
So that's a lot of people for Duquesne basketball in 1946 or today. But when the Tennessee team arrives at the gym, they're surprised, as Duquesne's warming up, they're surprised to see that Duquesne has a black player named Chuck Cooper, who's also arguably their best player, warming up with them.
I heard he had pretty cool shoes. That was Chuck Taylor.
I'm sure Chuck Cooper had cool shoes too.
Yeah.
Now Tennessee did know that that Duquesne had a black player, so they weren't surprised that they had a black player, but they didn't think he would play. So the Tennessee coach was named John Maurer. He had written a letter to Duquesne a couple of weeks before, informing them that having a black player was unacceptable to them. They couldn't have a black player to play against the University of Tennessee. And Maurer had done this before with other schools that they had played on the road who had black players. And those schools had all capitulated and said, okay, when you guys come to play, we'll bench the black players. And so when Tennessee comes to Duquesne, Maurer just assumes, even though he hadn't heard back from his letter, he just assumes that Duquesne was going to do the same thing. Well, surprise, Duquesne doesn't do that. And so now there's a conundrum because Tennessee has traveled all the way to Pittsburgh under what they say are false pretenses, right? And Coach Maurer says, look, these are Southern boys. They're not going to play if a black player plays. And so now a decision has to be made about whether or not to just say, okay, fine, we'll bench Cooper, or to stand firm, which also means that they're going to have to refund the admission of 2,600 people. And Cooper himself even offers to just sit, and he says, I don't want to cause a stir. Guys, just play without me. But the players actually take a vote and unanimously refuse to play if their teammate can't play. And the university stands behind them too. Judge Samuel Weiss is basically like the Duquesne AD at the time. He walks out to center court and announces to the crowd what had happened. And he says, quote, I insist that no player be barred from this game by reason of race, color, or creed. He says the principle of the matter it means more to us than a basketball game. So Tennessee is forced to leave the arena and go all the way back home with a forfeit loss. And I think the other cool thing, so not only does Duquesne stand up and say, no, we're not going to do this, but the other thing that happens is, 2,600 people showed up in probably cold weather wanting to see a basketball game. And so you kind of wonder how they're going to react to it. But when Weiss makes that announcement, the crowd actually gives him a standing ovation. And here's what, I think this is from the Pittsburgh Courier. I got it from one of the old newspapers. But this is what they wrote. They said when the Tennessee players started walking off the court, the Pittsburgh crowd, quote, hooted and booed and shamed them as no athletic team has ever been in the history of sports in Pennsylvania.
Nice.
And they actually had to have a police presence outside the arena because they were worried that they were going the Tennessee.
The Courier too. That's the African American paper
Right.
from the Hill.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And they had to have a police presence because they were worried that the Tennessee bus was going to get attacked or something by the fans that were so angry. That didn't happen. But it's a cool story, and it's at the time too, 1946. That was a little before a lot of the civil rights movement.
Jackie Robinson next season.
Yep.
Yeah.
So even before Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those good stories that I think should be more remembered. And it's one of those stories that definitely makes me proud to be a Duquesne alum. So good forgotten story there. Forgotten story number 5 is that time that Mel Blount sued Chuck Noll in the middle of the 1970s Super Bowl runs. So when you talk about the 1970 Steelers, obviously, lots of stories there. Great team, memorable decade, lots of memorable seasons. They won the Super Bowl in 74, 75, 78, 79. 72 was the Immaculate Reception. 76 was that year that they had that great defense, but they lost the championship game. And the one season that's kind of smack in the middle of all that rarely gets talked about is 1977. What happened during the 1977 season? And it's one that actually had a lot of drama take place even before the season started. Jack Lambert held out that year and allegedly asked to be traded. He was upset about his contract. Ernie Holmes, the defensive lineman, was acquitted on charges of cocaine possession. And no, that was not the same year he shot at the police helicopter.
Okay,
that happened a few years earlier.
Jeez.
But the real crazy drama is when the Hall of Fame cornerback sued the Hall of Fame coach. So this all had started the previous season when the Steelers played the Raiders. And this was a regular season game. I think it was in September of 76. And George Atkinson of the Raiders, one of their defensive backs, who was, the Raiders had some really mean, nasty, physical, violent players. And George Atkinson hits Lynn Swann in the back of the head with his forearm, just clubs him in the head with a forearm. And Noll's really upset about it. And after the game, he says, quote, people that sick shouldn't be allowed to play this game. He says maybe it's a reflection on their coaching, kind of taking a shot at John Madden, the Raiders coach. And then he says there's a certain criminal element in every aspect of society, and apparently we have it in the NFL too.
Yeah, that's the part that always got him in trouble, was the criminal element.
Yep,
yeah.
That was the key phrase that everybody seizes on. So after Noll makes the comments, Pete Rozelle, the commissioner, he actually fines Atkinson. And Atkinson's really upset, and he thinks that he doesn't get fined if Noll doesn't come out and say he's part of the criminal element. And so a few months later, Atkinson, and the Raiders were a very litigious organization, right? Like Al Davis sued everybody. So Atkinson files a $3 million slander and libel lawsuit against Noll and the Steelers for calling him the criminal element. So now in the summer of 1977, as the next season and training camp's about to begin, there's a jury trial to decide this $3 million slander lawsuit. And Atkinson's lawyer, as his first witness, calls Chuck Noll to the stand and actually grills Noll for 9 hours on the witness stand. And one of the things Atkinson's lawyer does is he shows Noll and the jury a tape of Mel Blount taking a supposed cheap shot on someone. And the whole strategy is, oh, you say that my client's a criminal element, but look at your players doing the exact same kind of stuff. And Noll, I don't think anybody coaches Noll on the stand or anything, because he just basically begrudgingly admits that what Blount did was wrong too, and that he talked to Mel Blount after the game about it. And the lawyer kind of lawyers him into saying that Blount's part of the criminal element also. Noll doesn't really say that. He kind of says well, those are your words, not mine, kind of thing. But he gets him to say it, sort of say it under oath. And when Blunt hears about this, he takes it very personally. He's very upset and offended. And then Mel Blunt sues Chuck Noll for $5 million in compensatory damages, plus $1 million in punitive damages for being included in the, quote, criminal element. And Blunt said, quote, "There's no chance at all that I'll ever play for the Steelers under Chuck Noll again." So Blunt's really upset. He vows never to play for the Steelers again, and he's suing Chuck Noll. This is in 1977. This is right in the middle of the Steelers dynasty.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the jury in the Atkinson trial does rule in favor of the Steelers. And somewhere along the way, Blunt and Noll, make up. Blunt drops the suit, and they come to some kind of understanding. I'm not sure exactly what happens, but they settle things. And the team goes on to win 2 more Super Bowls with Mel Blunt, being the star cornerback. So all's well that ends well, but it's it's surprising that kind of gets lost to history because it happened right in the middle of all that. And Dan Rooney called it, quote, "the most depressing experience of my life." So,
and they didn't win a Super Bowl that year, did they?
No, they lost to
to
Denver in
yeah.
the playoffs. Denver actually went on to represent the AFC in the Super Bowl that year. It wasn't a real good season for them, but who could blame them after the season started out like that? It was just a whole mess. And I'm just surprised it doesn't get remembered more. And if that happened today, Steve, I mean...
Yeah, it would be, wow. It would, yeah. I think, too, like, a lot what was going on, like, Al Davis wanted to move. Remember, he always wanted to move the Raiders from Oakland to L.A. and back again, and the league kind of stopped him. So he would start, like, these kind of stuff. Like, there was that kind of theory that, like, he had kind of paid George Atkinson's lawyers' fees to do this, so that to annoy, like, the Steelers were considered like the darlings of the NFL back then, and so they were gonna, whereas the Raiders weren't. So this was just kind of like a nuisance, like, thing for Pete Rozelle and Rooney and the Rooneys and the Steelers in general. So there's always been that kind of theory behind all that legal maneuvering, and maybe it was effective a little bit there for Al Davis.
Well, and you're right. If it was just to start, just to be a nuisance, it worked. Even though they lost the lawsuit, it definitely submarined the season for the Steelers a little bit, and they just weren't able to do what they had done in the previous seasons. And Oakland plays in the AFC Championship game that year against Denver, and loses on a controversial call. But they didn't have to go through Pittsburgh, and so maybe that worked.
Was that the fumble that Madden always complained about?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Denver actually fumbled the ball at the goal line, but the referees missed it. It was a whole controversy.
Yeah.
Madden
complained about that more than, well, that was probably like his second thing behind the Immaculate Reception that he complained about.
Yeah, it's sad that the Raiders always seem to get hosed all the time, according to the Raiders. Forgotten story number 4 is that time that Hines Ward nearly cheated the Steelers to a playoff victory. So in 2007, it was Mike Tomlin's first year as coach, and it's a pretty successful year. They win the division, but unfortunately, they had a whole rash of injuries at the end of the season. They kind of limp into the playoffs, and their first playoff game is at Heinz Field against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jaguars had badly beaten them just a few weeks earlier, and because of the injuries and because of the trajectories of the two teams, Jacksonville's expected to just also crush the Steelers in the playoff game, and that's how most of the game goes. I mean, the Jaguars just are all over the Steelers. They're up by 18 points in the fourth quarter, so the game's pretty much over. The season's pretty much over. But amazingly, the Steelers start to stage a comeback. They score 2 touchdowns to get within 4, and then David Garrard, the Jaguars quarterback who never threw interceptions, throws a pass that's intercepted by Ike Taylor, who never makes interceptions. And Taylor returns it deep into Jacksonville territory, and all of a sudden, down by 4, the Steelers have a chance to miraculously take the lead. But this time, the Jaguars' defense holds, and the Steelers are faced with 4th and goal from the 2-yard line. And they have to go for it. Remember, they're down by 4. There's only a few minutes left in the game, so they have to score a touchdown. It's sort of touchdown or bust at this point. And so the play they call is a fade pass, and Dunn throws it in the corner of the end zone for Hines Ward, It's over Ward's head. It's incomplete. And so the Steelers turn it over on downs, and it looks like Jacksonville has basically weathered this comeback, and they're going to hold on to win the playoff game, but hold everything because there's a flag. And the call is pass interference on Brian Williams, the Jaguars' cornerback. And as soon as the flag is thrown...
Not the NBC anchor, huh?
No, not that Brian Williams. We could make a few jokes there about him making up the call. But as soon as the flag is thrown, Williams just goes absolutely ballistic. He's jumping up and down. He's screaming, and for good reason. So what had actually happened, and you can see it on the replay, so Ward and Williams are locked up on the line of scrimmage, and Ward basically put Williams in like a headlock, and then he pulls him into the end zone by his face mask. And when Ben releases the ball, Ward pulls his hand away from Williams' face mask to make it look like Williams was holding him, like he couldn't get his hand out. Like he locked onto his face mask just so he could make it look like he was trying to pull away from him. He knew it was going to be a fade pass. The refs totally fall for it. They misread the play. They give the Steelers a 1st and goal, which the Steelers convert into the go-ahead touchdown. I think the reason no one remembers this is even the Jacksonville fans is because the Jaguars eventually come back and kick a game-winning field goal, so they end up winning the game anyway. But I think it's a story that, this 2007 was the same season as Spygate for the Patriots, and so many Steeler fans were up in arms about, I can't believe they cheat. They're cheaters. They cheat. And I think, fair. That's a fair point about New England, but Steelers weren't exactly innocent, and Hines Ward was one of those guys that we all loved in Pittsburgh, but man, we would have hated him if he played anywhere else. And he cheated. I mean, there's no other way to put it than he cheated. He had the guy's face mask, and he got away with it, and he almost cheated the Steelers to a playoff victory.
Well, the NFL after this game apologized about the officiating in this game.
Did they?
Yes, they apologized to the Steelers about it.
Did they?
Yes, because on the field goal that Jacksonville kicked, Aaron Smith was held like blatantly, and the refs didn't throw a flag. So maybe that was the Jacksonville makeup call. So the breaks I always think the breaks normally even out if you just keep plugging away. So
they do. I
think in that case maybe okay, yeah, Ward pulled a fast one to take the lead, but Jacksonville ended up winning anyway and kind of got away with one of their own. So
fair. I just think it's a contrast to we said the thing earlier about nobody cared enough about Richard Mendenhall to penalize the Ravens for putting a bounty out on them, but also we're guilty of the same thing where if it's Hines Ward it's okay, but if it's Bill Belichick it's not okay. So yeah, that's all. But yeah, that's one of those stories that I think a lot of people don't remember. And again, I think had the Steelers won that game, I think it would have been a much bigger controversy.
Well, that was like tough guy Tomlin too. That was back in the tough guy. I think he was a young coach and he had a veteran team and he was kind of like trying to get their attention. So
he learned some lessons that year. That would be an interesting season to do an episode on because it's again, I think that whole season, there's not a whole lot of memorable games from that season. It was a good season, but I think the tough guy thing, they were worn out by the playoffs. They were injured.
Well, he says that, yeah. But see, but it's kind of getting off a tangent.
Yeah, different story. You're right, but that would be a good one to delve into. Yeah. But anyway, Hines Ward's a cheater. I mean, I like Hines Ward. Don't get me wrong; he was great. We don't win Super Bowls without Hines Ward, but he was a cheater.
Yeah, Keith Rivers would probably agree with you. At least the cheap shot artist. Yeah. Well, he was voted like the dirtiest player in the NFL.
Yeah, and again, for good reason. Just trying to be objective as a Steeler fan. Again, love the guy. Wouldn't have traded him for anything, but he cheated. Forgotten story number 3 is that time that Art Rooney stepped in to convince the NHL to award an expansion franchise to Pittsburgh. So in 1967, the NHL has 6 teams. They decide they're going to expand to 12 teams. And if you really want to point to like the most significant sort of moment in NHL history, it had to be this expansion because the NHL was such a small league. I mean, 6 teams. Like that's not a major league. And they wanted to be a major North American sports league. And so expanding to 12 teams got them there. And then, of course, they expanded from there. and now they're up to 30 or whatever. And so a lot of cities put in bids, right? They want to be part of this NHL expansion. Pittsburgh's one of the cities that puts in a bid, and the original 6 existing teams, they're the ones that are going to vote on who to award the expansion teams to. And the Norris brothers owned 2 of the teams, the Blackhawks and the Red Wings, and they're going to vote for Buffalo over Pittsburgh. They think Buffalo has a better chance of having a successful hockey franchise or successful hockey market. And Art Rooney apparently knew the Norris brothers. I think it was from horse racing. All 3 of them were into horse racing, so he knows these guys. And Jack McGregor, we mentioned him earlier, the guy that eventually became the owner of the Penguins. He reaches out to Art Rooney and says, "Hey, I heard you're friends with them. Can you call them, because apparently they're going to vote against Pittsburgh." So Art Rooney gets on the phone with them, and he tells the Norris brothers that it would be personally embarrassing to him if Buffalo was selected over Pittsburgh. Like he said, that would personally hurt me. And the Norris brothers apparently, like, they're so convinced by that they vote for Pittsburgh. And that's how the Penguins are created, is because Art Rooney got on the phone with the Norris brothers and said, I'd be personally embarrassed. And because people respected Art Rooney that much, they switched their vote and gave this franchise to Pittsburgh.
But at least the Norris brothers got a division named after him for a couple of years out of the whole thing.
They did. I think that was named after their father, but, family name. Nevertheless.
But yeah, and like you said, Buffalo did get a franchise. It's been pretty successful.
Yeah. So yeah,
it all kind of worked out for everybody. But that's odd that, like, the Norrises would think that much of Art Rooney.
Well, and it's kind of like the Tom Brady, Sidney Crosby thing, where it's one of those cross sports stories, right?
Yeah.
Where a football figure and a hockey figure, wouldn't even think they would even run in the same circles, but the Norris brothers and Art Rooney did, and obviously it was pretty convincing. So, and you're right, Buffalo gets a team eventually. I think it was only like 3 years later. So they called the Sabres, who still play there today. So they did get a team. So don't feel too bad for Buffalo. And Pittsburgh, who knows? If Buffalo would have got the team in '67, who knows if Pittsburgh would have submitted a bid 3 years later, or if they just would have been like, okay, this isn't going to work.
We still had the minor league, the Hornets. So
maybe.
And the Hornets were kind of a very, very successful minor league team. So.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, you just don't know what happens. Is there a Penguins franchise today if they don't, if Art Rooney doesn't step in the middle of that? So I think that's a good story that, again, I didn't know about that until very recently. So we're going to stick with Art Rooney for the number 2 forgotten story in Pittsburgh sports history, and it's that time that Art Rooney sold the Steelers. So everybody always thinks of Art Rooney as the guy that owned the Steelers for years and years. The Rooney family has always owned the Steelers. It's always been in that family. Well, for a while it actually wasn't. So on December 9th, 1940, the Steelers finished the season 2-7-2. It's another year of bad football. It's another year of financial setbacks. Remember, the Steelers are only 7 years old at this time. And Rooney just says, you know what, this isn't working. And he sells the Steelers to a guy named Alexis Thompson for $160,000, which is the equivalent of about $3 million today, which is pretty good money. Not obviously an NFL franchise would sell for a lot more than that today. $3 million would be like what you pay the kicker. But at the time, that's pretty good money. And so Alexis Thompson is a guy that's really young. He's 26 years old, but his father had just died and left him with like millions of dollars. So the way, again, I don't know much about Alexis Thompson, but the way he's portrayed in the media back then is kind of like a young playboy. He just inherited money.
He made his money the old-fashioned way.
Right.
He inherited it.
Right. So this is kind of, at least they're portraying this as kind of like a vanity project for him. He's like, ooh, I want to own a football team, and I have all this money to spend. So he pays top dollar for the Steelers. And just like new owners do today, Thompson kind of says all the right things. Like, we're going to make the team a winner. He goes out and he pays a lot of money for a new head coach. He also renames the team to the Pittsburgh Ironmen. Like, they actually renamed the team Pittsburgh Ironmen. Now, Alexis Thompson, he lives in New York City. He doesn't live in Pittsburgh, and he doesn't want to manage the team remotely. So he says he does agree that he's going to keep the team in Pittsburgh for the 1941 season, but ultimately he makes it known he wants to move them out of Pittsburgh because he doesn't want to be in New York managing a team in Pittsburgh. Well, he can't move them to New York. They already have a team, the Giants. So he decides that Boston is the next best market. Like he can easily commute to Boston, and it's a good market, and they don't have a team. Meanwhile, so Rooney has now sold the Steelers, so he buys stock in the Philadelphia Eagles with his friend Bert Bell, and he becomes part owner of that franchise. So Bell and Rooney now own the Philadelphia Eagles, and Rooney decides that he's still going to live in Pittsburgh, and he also has this plan. So Rooney and Bell, like Thompson's going to move the Steelers to Boston or wherever, right? He's going to move them out of Pittsburgh. And once that happens, Rooney and Bell have a plan to have the Eagles split their home games between Pittsburgh and Philly. So you talked earlier, Steve, about them playing games in West Virginia.
Yeah.
So they want to play games in Pittsburgh and Philly. In fact, they're going to rename the team from Philadelphia Eagles to Pennsylvania Keystones.
Nice.
So like they're going to
take the whole state.
Take the whole state, right?
Yeah.
Why not? Now we have all this territory, and we can take the whole state, and we'll make more money. We'll get more fans that way. Well, the rest of the owners, so Thompson wants to move the team, and Rooney and Bell want to take
the whole state, yeah.
And the owners balk at this for two reasons. So number one, the whole plan to move a team to Boston. Two other teams had already tried and failed in Boston. One was the Boston Bulldogs, who was a team in the 1920s that folded. And then the Boston Redskins, who moved to Washington, D.C. because they were not successful in Boston. So the owners are like, football will never work in Boston. You know, who would ever put a team in Boston? That would be a failure.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah. They'll never win anything.
No, they'll never win anything. So that's reason number one. And then reason number two is the owner of the Redskins, George Preston Marshall, who was a guy that was pretty fiery and outspoken. He catches wind of Rooney's plan for the Eagles to make them the whole state of Pennsylvania, and he flips out because his team's in Washington. He's pulling fans from, central Pennsylvania.
Yeah, central Pennsylvania is kind of a weird area like that. Like there's a lot of I have a lot of family from there, and like football-wise, back when I was growing up, there was no Baltimore Colts. So they were more either Redskins fan, Steeler fans, and there were some Eagles fans, but it was more Redskins Steelers. The Steelers are so big anymore. I mean, they almost take over that.
Well, right, and
but it wasn't that case in 1940 for sure.
Right, and if you had a team called the Pennsylvania Keystones,
you would hopefully pull them in.
And if you lived in Lancaster or Harrisburg or York or whatever, then hey, that's my team too.
Yeah.
Right.
And you could do the Huntington, West Virginia thing, play games in Harrisburg, or Erie, Scranton.
Yeah. It was a good plan. I mean, honestly, especially back then, there was no TV.
Yeah, so that's
Everything
you would kind of
was at the
barnstorm the state,
Right.
and
Right.
come up with a good thing.
Yep, you made all your money from attendance.
Yeah.
And so it was actually a pretty good plan. But again, if you're the owner of the Redskins, you're like, no way.
Because those fans might be Harrisburg to DC probably isn't that far of a trip for even back then, and maybe the train probably went there, so maybe there were some fans that were commuting down to DC for the football games. So.
Yeah, and he's just like, no way, you're not taking the whole state of Pennsylvania. So the owners just say they nix the whole thing. You're not moving the Ironmen to Boston, the Steelers to Boston, and you're not going to make the Eagles the whole state of Pennsylvania. So now Alexis Thompson's stuck owning a team in Pittsburgh and running it from New York City. And then Rooney's plan and Bell's plan of, covering the whole state, that's not going to work. Not only were the owners against it, but obviously if the Thompson's team is staying in Pittsburgh, then that wouldn't have worked anyway. So now Thompson and Rooney are both like, oh, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. So Rooney actually is like, hey, he goes to Thompson. He's like, you know what city's kind of close to New York City? Philadelphia. That's an easy one to you could run a team in Philadelphia from New York City. And Art Rooney basically offers to trade cities with Thompson. So this is a little hard to follow, so I will do my best here. So here's what happens. Thompson takes all of the Steelers, aka the Ironmen, players and coaches to Philadelphia. Art Rooney and Bert Bell take all of the Eagles players and coaches to Pittsburgh. Thompson also ditches the Ironman name and decides to call his team in Philadelphia the Eagles, since that's what the football team there was already called. And they keep the same uniforms, the same colors and all that. So I'm try to put this in perspective. It would be like today. So today, Art Rooney III owns the Steelers, Jeffrey Lurie owns the Eagles. It would be like if those two guys swapped teams. So the team in Pittsburgh would still be called the Steelers, and they would still have black and gold uniforms. But the head coach of the Steelers would be Doug Peterson, and the quarterback of the Steelers would be Carson Wentz. And meanwhile, the team in Philadelphia would still be called the Eagles, and they would still wear green and white. But Mike Tomlin would be their coach, and their roster would be all players that played for the Steelers the previous season.
Makes sense, yeah. And a Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick. Yeah. Sure. This is a terrible idea at this point.
I mean, it's so goofy. And if you go look at...
Is that what actually happened?
Yeah, that's what actually happened. If you go look at the...
So that's what actually happened? Oh,
Yes.
I thought Rooney just bought the shares back off of...
This is what actually... If you go look at...
Thompson actually... So the team... Wow.
So
technically, I've been an Eagles fan all these years.
Technically, yes.
Wow, I'm not sure how to make my peace with that.
It's
Since the Eagles, outside of the Patriots, are just one of those teams I'm not a fan of.
If you go to Pro Football Reference or one of those sites, and you look at the 1941 Steelers roster, and click on any of those players see where they played the previous year, it was Philadelphia. There's no player on the 1941 Steelers that played for Pittsburgh the previous season, because that was the Eagles roster.
Nice.
That moved to Pittsburgh and became the Steelers.
And this was before the Steagles.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And actually the incorporated owner of the Steelers for about 3 or 4 years was Philadelphia Football Club or something, owned the Steelers. And then
him and Burt Bell always did have a close relationship.
They did. And then Burt Bell eventually a few years later, he becomes the commissioner of the NFL, and he has to sell off his ownership shares. And he does that to the, what's the family? The McGinty's, the Art Rooney, in-law family. So he basically sells the shares back to the Rooney family.
Okay.
And that's how the Rooneys then become the sole owners again for the rest of the time.
Of the Steelers.
So Bell actually co-owned the Steelers for a few years, but then he sells his shares, and again, no one really remembers that. It's a footnote. But yeah, you made a Simpsons reference earlier, Steve. It's like that episode where they move the town.
Yeah, they litter everything because they were taking trash. Homer was a sanitation person. Yeah. Yeah, and they just moved the town. They were like, oh, here's the plan to save the town. We're just moving everything 5 miles down the road.
Right. So, yes, the team that plays in Pittsburgh right now was technically the Philadelphia Eagles, and the team that plays in Philadelphia right now
I don't know how I'd feel about, Carson Wentz, because, I still feel like he's kind of overrated, and I much like Ben. I think Carson Wentz is the discount version of Ben Roethlisberger, So what, the Eagles get the real Ben Roethlisberger and we get the fake Ben Roethlisberger? What the heck kind of deal is that?
Yeah, it would be.
So do we still keep all the Super Bowls and stuff, and the Eagles still have their one measly little Super Bowl?
Yeah, well, that was
their Chuck Bednarik championship from 1960.
So it was kind of do you remember when the Browns moved to Baltimore?
The Browns just took technically a 5-year hiatus,
right.
And the Ravens
but they kept their
were
history.
created. Yeah.
So that's what happened here. The Steelers, the Steelers are from 1933 to present, and the Eagles, whatever year they were founded to the present. There's no switching of histories. They kept the history, they kept the colors, they kept the uniforms.
They just traded.
But the coaches and the players, the front office, everything, all the assets went to the other city.
That's impressive.
Isn't that a weird story? And I never
I never even heard of that before.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. This is maybe that should have been number one.
Yeah.
But that was one of those stories that again just no one remembers that actually happened. And again, the NFL was not what the NFL is today. So I don't think anybody was well, what do we do with the histories? It was whatever. We'll be lucky to have a season next year with the war starting. Who cares?
Yeah.
So that's what happened.
So did that Thompson? I wonder how much longer he owned the.
He owned the Eagles. I think when they won the 47 NFL championship. I think he was their owner. I think he actually won.
So he was still part of the whole Steagles debacle too, or well, not debacle. They weren't that bad.
No, he was part of that.
Them and the Bidwells were more the debacle.
I want to say he owned the team into the 50s, and then I think he died very young. He got sick and he died pretty young. But yeah, he actually owned the Eagles. They won a championship under him. So
Maybe
that's how
they
it all
should just
worked
do
out.
that. Maybe they just trade players just randomly, like have like a random draw, and like
Trade
we're
teams.
we're just trading everybody, you know.
I'll give you the Arizona Cardinals for the Miami Dolphins.
Like who gets stuck with like who's like a really bad traditional team like
Cincinnati.
yeah, like oh no, we got the Bengals.
Yeah, maybe we shouldn't do that. I'll take the Steelers.
That they did it in baseball. We could ditch the Pirates for a couple of years.
Yeah, but nobody would take them. That's the problem. All right, so that now brings us to the number one forgotten Pittsburgh sports story. And it's that time that Pittsburgh won a pro basketball championship. So in 1967, again, we're going to mention that year a couple times in this episode, the American Basketball Association, the ABA, was formed with 11 teams. And it was billed as like this flashy alternative to like the old boring stoic NBA. And they, instead of playing with a boring orange ball, they played with a red, white, and blue ball. They added these crazy innovations like a 3-point line and a slam dunk contest.
In the NBA, were you allowed to dunk back then? Remember the NCAA, you weren't allowed to dunk.
I don't know the answer to that, but it definitely, that was not the style of play. The style of play was not flashy. It was very like Red Auerbach style.
Well, the awesome was the prizes for the slam dunk contest. Was like, do you remember like I remember one of my aunt had this TV that sat on the floor and was like literally as big as this desk. That was like I think Julius Erving like won like in the 70s, and that's what he got for winning the slam dunk contest.
Nice.
Which I'm sure just was awesome for him moving that thing around.
And that was, that was a time that the ABA was not the only like rival sports. Like the AFL was rivaling the NFL at the time.
Yeah, they were the team that finally made a go in Boston of the football in Boston.
Right,
was
that's
the
true.
Patriots.
The Patriots, yeah. And so that was kind of the culture in the 60s, right? You had a big culture clash between like the old fashioned whatever button down versus the new.
It was like the baby boomers versus their parents' generation.
Right.
And one thing I've learned about baby boomers, it's like if you want to understand a baby boomer's motivation, will it piss off my parents? If the answer is yes, it is going to happen.
Well,
yeah.
Well, the ABA, I think the ABA pissed off.
It's like,
people's
this is
parents.
going to piss off. Let's do it.
Right.
Yeah, woohoo. Mom and dad are mad. Yeah.
And
It could be like the most teenage response to every.
Well,
if you have any teenagers or had any, that's like in the decision tree process. It's like, is this going to make my parents angry? If the answer, yep, okay, I'm in.
and that's probably why the ABA actually has some pretty good success, and that's probably why, Steve, because the ABA is for sure a league that would make your parents, go,
what's this slam dunking?
Yeah, what's that man?
You can't
slam
put the
dunk.
flag on a ball. That's against the flag code, man.
Back in my day, they just shot the ball and they shook hands.
Yeah,
after
Bob
every
Cousy
shot.
didn't have a red, white, and blue ball. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the ABA actually has some popularity. Actually, just like the AFL, the ABA ultimately merges with the NBA in the mid-1970s. And there's still teams today in the NBA who are old ABA teams. So that's sort of the history of the ABA. Now, when the league first starts, Pittsburgh actually has one of the inaugural teams called the Pittsburgh Pipers. They play their home games at the Civic Arena, and they have the really good fortune of having one of the best basketball players in the world, Hall of Famer Connie Hawkins. Hawkins had been blackballed by the NBA because he was named in a point-shaving investigation when he was playing college ball at Iowa. And he was named in this investigation. He was never formally charged. He was never convicted. But I think Iowa took away his scholarship, and the NBA didn't want anything to do with him. I mean, I don't know if there's a racial component to that. I don't know the whole story there, but it sounds really unfair because he was never charged with anything. So whether he was involved or not, he was just assumed to be guilty.
And then Boston College really was point shaving, but that wasn't.
That was
until the
later.
80s.
That was Henry Hill.
Yes, I was going to say fun fact. You know who was involved in that?
Yeah.
It was good old Henry Hill.
Henry Hill from Goodfellas. So anyway, Hawkins has been blackballed by the NBA, but that's fortunate for this new upstart league and fortunate for Pittsburgh because they're like, sure, we'll sign him. He's a great basketball player. And the Pipers put together a really good regular season. They go into the playoffs. They beat the Indiana Pacers in the first round. The Pacers, of course, one of those ABA teams that still exist today. And then they beat the Minnesota Muskies and they reached the ABA finals against a team called the New Orleans Buccaneers, who I think maybe have the goofiest like team logo of all time.
That definitely has to go up on the website.
Yeah, I got to put that. It's like, to describe it, it's like this little miniature pirate.
It kind of looks like Sinbad. Yeah. Not Sinbad the comedian, like Sinbad the swashbuckling guy.
Right, because he's got like the mustache.
Tales of Arabian Nights there, yeah.
Yeah, he's got a mustache. He doesn't have a shirt on. He's shirtless. He has like a belt buckle, and he's like carrying a sword and dribbling a basketball at the same time. So goofy logo, obviously pretty good team because they're in the finals against the Pipers. As this is happening, the Pipers are picking up all kinds of bandwagon fans and packing the Civic Arena because just like any other city, we love a winner in Pittsburgh. And so all of a sudden, they're starting to get a lot of steam and press. The Pipers, the series goes to 7 games, but the Pipers win, and they bring a pro basketball championship to Pittsburgh. I think, we said in a previous episode that Pittsburgh has 16 pro sports championships, so 6 for the Steelers, 5 for the Penguins, 5 for the Pirates. But, we don't ever mention this one, but this was a pro basketball league that Pittsburgh won a championship. And I think probably
there are no Pittsburgh Triangles, don't forget them too.
I did not put the tennis team in here. That would have been a good one. That would have been a good honorable mention.
Yeah.
But I think the reason probably no one remembers the championship in 1967-68 is because the team moved to Minnesota right after that season. Like hey, we won a championship. Now let's pack up and move the franchise to Minnesota. So the ABA was still gaining traction at this point. And it ends up being a mistake. The team actually moves back to Pittsburgh a few years later because they weren't successful in Minnesota. But by that point, Hawkins was in the NBA, and that support that the fans, that bandwagon support they kind of had, like they'd moved the team away. So when they came back, nobody really cared at that point.
Well, if basketball, I think, was ever going to take hold in Pittsburgh, this probably would have been the era to do it because the Penguins hadn't become the Penguins yet. Maybe even the 80s, like before Mario. Like, if he could have got a basketball franchise in. But now, yeah, I mean, I don't see, like, how you would be able to support a basket because it would compete directly with the Penguins. And I don't know that Pittsburgh's a big enough city for that.
Yes, I agreed.
There are bigger cities that don't have any pro sports teams, So, it's definitely one of those odd little things. And I do think this is in our one podcast, the Great Pittsburgh Sports Championship bracket thing. I think it did have the Pipers on there.
Yeah.
So that was, they said they just folded. They don't even exist anymore.
Right. They moved to Minnesota. They moved back to Pittsburgh.
And then they just.
I think they changed their name to the Condors.
Yeah, and they really, like, there really hasn't been a successful Pittsburgh basketball franchise.
And you wonder, like you said, Steve, it's a really good point that was maybe that was the point. So imagine after they win the championship.
They stay here and they don't have to win another championship. If they just make like the playoffs and have some success, maybe they build a fan base.
Right. If they just would have kind of stuck it through and said, okay, we're losing money, but we got all these fans at the end of the season. Maybe we can parlay that into more fans next season. But they kind of gave up. They'd probably. I mean, I don't know the whole backstory, but I'm guessing they had probably made the decision.
Halfway
before,
through, yeah.
Right. So, but who knows? Yeah, if they would have stuck it out, you said the Penguins weren't the Penguins. The Steelers also weren't the Steelers at that point. This was 1968.
Yeah, it was really the Pirates were really the most popular game in town.
Right. So who knows what would have happened? Who knows if they would have lasted long enough to become like the Indiana Pacers or the New Jersey Nets or those other teams that merged into the NBA that still exist today. But alas, it wasn't meant to be. So, but that's our final forgotten Pittsburgh sports story, the Pittsburgh Pipers bringing a pro basketball championship to the city of Pittsburgh. Steve, any final thoughts on our forgotten stories before we wrap up?
Forgotten stories. These were all pretty forgotten. Some I didn't know, but no, that's definitely a great list. And the Steelers had cheerleaders for 5 minutes. That was but they got rid of them because they, I guess were more moralistic than other. The Rudies didn't like cheerleaders for some reason.
Yeah, I almost put that in the honorable mentions that the Steelers, the 1 year or whatever that they had cheerleaders. I think their cheerleaders still get together. There's some kind of like they still get together every year for a reunion or something.
My goodness, that's so long ago. Is there? I mean, not to be rude, but I mean, there can't be too many left there.
Well, maybe they used to get together. Maybe I'm thinking of an article I read 20 years ago, but I think they were called the Steelerettes actually. So yeah, I'm sure there's other things that I could have put on this list. I mean, I love personally. I love delving into like the stories that we don't always think about. We don't always remember, and so there's probably more of these. We could probably do a part 2 at some point. But there's a lot of good stories in Pittsburgh sports history.
Did Connie Hawkins ever do anything else in the NBA?
Yeah, he had a pretty good NBA career. I mean, he's in the Basketball Hall of Fame.
So he must have been pretty successful.
I think he had a pretty successful NBA career. It started really
Who did he
late.
play for in the NBA?
I want to say Philadelphia, but I don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But yeah, he was a really good basketball. Unfortunately, his career started so late because, again, he was sort of blackballed for a long time. But you know, he definitely had success with the Pipers, and it's just a shame that they didn't last more than one season. Well, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Please check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Pittsburgh Sports Memories. Please check out our website. It's pittsburghsportsmemories.weebly.com. And also, if you like what you hear, please go rate us on whatever podcast service you're using, because that helps other people find us.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for enjoying the podcast.
Bye.